Good morning, everybody. It's 11 o'clock and welcome to our Entrepreneurial Leadership to Pivot and Grow webinar this morning with Dr. Chris Cramphorn, who is Associate Professor for Enterprise and Leadership at Edinburgh Napier's Business School. Chris is fascinated by complex problems, entrepreneurship and innovation, and has applied these skills to real-world problems such as responses to climate change, resilience in supply networks, strategic insight, utilizing big data, and also educational entrepreneurship and employability requirements. So we're going to draw on all that expertise and experience this morning as he talks through leadership to pivot and grow, which we hope will be of great interest and use to everyone this morning. Just a few housekeeping words from me to remind everybody, as per the invitation that was sent out, that the webinar is being recorded. So we'll send you a copy of this after the event for use, and it may be hosted on the university website. So just bear that in mind with any questions. We'll run through the presentation itself, I think for about 25 minutes to half an hour, Chris, and then invite people to submit questions. Please use the chat panel during Chris's presentation if you want to flag a question, and we'll come back to that at the end of the presentation itself. There's also the raised hands function in the bottom right of your screen, which if you've got the panelist bar open, which you could use during the Q&A session. So I'd mentioned that Chris has broad experience, and he's advised universities in the UK and Europe on innovative teaching and learning, improving research impact, and enhancing commercialization and knowledge transfer. But his current interests are focused on SME growth and innovation, especially in the development of new business and economic models, including the circular economy and technology-enhanced innovation. So we hope that aligns with everybody's interests this morning. And without any further ado, I'll hand across to Chris and invite you to talk to us on entrepreneurial leadership to pivot and grow. Thanks, Chris.
Thanks, Ron. I hope everyone can hear me okay. As Ron was saying, I've actually spent quite a lot of time within academia as well as within the private sector. I've been an entrepreneur and investor myself, and a lot of the material that we're going to talk about today stems from both that academic and that industrial experience. And I've worked quite a lot with high growth firms and looking at how they can develop cultures of entrepreneurship and how they can pivot and they can grow. So without further ado, I'll start. So one of the key factors that's obviously around at the moment is COVID-19 and the relative aftershocks that's having in terms of the economy. I think what we've already started recognizing is that there is a precariousness to both the supply chains and the way that customers are actually purchasing at the moment. There's a precariousness of employment. And we're starting to already see that there are changes in the way that people are looking at how they are actually approaching work, and that's suggesting that we're increasingly in need for an ability to be agile within the environment. We're seeing these changes in expectations of work and employment. I know I'm sat in my living room doing this webinar, and a lot of people have spent quite a lot of time away from their traditional offices. And that also reflects what's happening in terms of consumption. For example, Amazon has been doing a roaring trade, delivering items to people's homes. So the way we're consuming it is changing. And there's also a change in the nature of how people are actually perceiving how they do work and their relationship with their employers. That means that we need to have a reassurance of our employees and our customers that what we're doing is still relevant to them, but also flipping this around and giving them a sense of empowerment so that they can actually take on board and help us develop better products and services. There are also changes in technology acceptance. And certainly the strategic use of technology has become particularly important. The rise of items such as Teams, Zoom, quite a lot of basically anything online has become particularly important for a lot of organizations. And that includes for very small organizations that traditionally didn't use a lot of technology. And the way that we're seeing that business models are starting to have to evolve derives from quite a lot of changes in the economy. So we've already said about consumers and home delivery, but we're seeing that the nature of how hospitality, for example, has been developing through, for example, Deliveroo. It means that the way that we actually do business is starting to have to change. And there are some ability for us to actually react to these changes, but also take them on board to be able to actually develop stronger organizations, to be able to pivot and to be able to grow the organizations that we work for. So as part of that, what we need to start thinking about is something called entrepreneurial leadership, and that's kind of a traditional academic definition. I think for me, and particularly having worked with small businesses, a better way of actually thinking about this are that entrepreneurial leaders identify opportunities or work with their followers, with their stakeholders to identify opportunities. And then from that, they influence them and they empower them to be able to validate their ideas and then convert those ideas into new realities, new products, new services, new business models, new ways of actually operating the economy. And that is really crucial because it's a slightly different way of thinking about the world. And one crucial factor of this is that they create new entrepreneurial leaders. Leaders do not all reside at the top of an organization. Leaders are people who can be at any level of the organization or within supply chains. We've seen that particularly, for example, with responses to COVID, with, for example, the development of ventilators, masks, and so on, that people who you would not normally have expected to be leaders have actually taken this on board and pushed forward with new ideas. And that's crucial because it creates an entrepreneurial culture. And that's something that we need to actually think about. And how can we actually create that? And how can we do that systematically so that we can control what's happening? So one of the reasons why we need to think about controlling is that most entrepreneurs' planning systems in their ventures are really informal and unsystematic, and that doesn't work particularly well in terms of organizations that are facing a lot of change very quickly. You need to be much more systematic. On the flip side of that, most managers' planning systems and processes are really, really rigid, and they're very difficult to cope with quite large economic shocks and very fast changes to the economy and their environment. So what we need to think about in terms of this is we're heading into another level of uncertainty. We've got the changes that are coming through now we've got moving away from lockdown, but we've also got factors such as Brexit that are appearing as well. So getting that formalized system of planning and empowerment within entrepreneurial leadership, I believe, is absolutely crucial. And the ideas that come from academic and from industrial sources that I'm going to present, these should give you a good starting point of how this can actually be developed in your organizations and how you can start to pivot and grow the organization. So one of the key factors that's probably happening within most organizations at the moment is that everyone's looking at income and expenditure. They're looking at their cash flows, and quite rightly. What is crucial in terms of this is that there becomes an over-reliance on looking at purely income and expenditure, that people keep trying to sell the same things over and over again. And that will then have an impact, because if people are not buying, then obviously it means that your expenditure becomes greater than your income and you make a loss. If we're thinking more entrepreneurially, and if we're thinking about how we're going to pivot and grow, we need to be thinking much more beyond those short-term income and expenditure components towards looking at assets and liabilities. So an asset is basically anything that allows us to have a flow, and it could be a flow of income, it could be a flow of data, it could be a flow of carbon if you were looking at an organization that was particularly in an environment. If you're thinking about an asset, it's something that is a definable thing. It's a tangible asset or it's an intangible asset. It allows you to make money from it. And that's crucial because that contrasts obviously with liabilities, which take money out of the organization. And as we're changing, we need to think about what assets and liabilities we've got. And one of the crucial assets we very often have that are overlooked are our own sets of staff, that they have ideas, that they're connected through to the supply chains, they're connected through to our customer bases, and we can use them as assets. As we change and pivot, also recognize that things that used to be assets might well now start to become liabilities. And we've seen this with a number of industries that where traditional big supply chains had been put in place, as perceptions have changed and the economies change, that they've become very much liabilities. Throughout this process, then, we need to think about how we can create these assets that we can then use to generate income. So one of the common ways of thinking about how we grow an organization, how we start to think about how organizations can pivot is something like the traditional Ansoff matrix. So imagine that we are, for example, making and selling bicycles. We would have an existing product, and if we were looking purely as an income and expenditure approach, then probably all we're trying to do is sell more and more of our product within that existing market. That's a problem, though, is if our marketplace is changing, and we'll come back to that. Is exactly what we need to think about. How do we pivot? How can we move to the next stage? Likewise, in our existing marketplace, we have an ability to add new products and services. It could be, for example, an e-bike. It could be selling other products of the moment, for example, masks. In our existing products and services, we may have components that we can use and sell into new marketplaces. So I've actually worked with an organization that took bicycle components and then converted them into wind turbines and then sold them on. So that's something that could be picked up. Likewise, at the moment, masks, for example, are particularly important. It's maybe one of our existing products, but we could sell into a new market. Alternatively, it could be something that's completely outside our existing marketplace. So we have essentially an ability to go and build apps. We have an ability to actually go away from our existing marketplace. That is really risky, though. And every time we pivot and move away, there are levels of risk. What is crucial in terms of this is the fact that there are ways that we can do this which are less risky, and secondly actually don't consume a lot of resources. And one good starting point in terms of that is thinking about our staff and actually starting to develop their ability to bring on board new ideas. How can we do that? Well, if you think about how most traditional products are kind of appearing, you expect that there's large research and development and that there are new sets of products which are built over years. That doesn't work very well, particularly in environments which are changing very quickly and where you have to think about your cash flow. You have a couple of options that you can do with this, and one is something with the bird in the hand principle. Start really simply. You don't have to have a perfect product. It doesn't have to be a perfect opportunity. Start very simply with what you've got, and then set affordable losses. Know what your failure points are going to be. In other words, you know that you're going to commit £1,000, for example, to seeing whether a product or service works, or from that, you can set, for example, okay, we're going to continue with this provided it doesn't cannibalize our existing customer base. Likewise, we could be starting with a lemonade principle. This is an opportunity time to develop two things. First of all, an ability to become slightly more flexible, but secondly, and perhaps more importantly, it gives us some time and space to think about, are we actually really servicing our customers? Can we be doing this better? And also at this point, recognize that there is an ability to start connecting with other organizations within the industry and across industries, something called the crazy quilt principle. And that essentially means, can we service our customers? Can we actually support ourselves much better? Because we're actually starting to connect into particular partnerships. So how can we do this? Well, one good starting point is to empower our stakeholders. And those stakeholders can be our employees, but also as well, they could be wider advocates. It could be our customers. It could be people in our supply chain. How can we do that systematically? Well, essentially, that's what I'm going to talk about in a few minutes. But what is crucial is that we need to, when we're actually talking to stakeholders, we need to communicate very clearly. And if we promise something, we actually deliver on that. So if we've got employees, if we've got stakeholders coming on board, we need to give them incentives and stick to those incentives. So how can we start? Well, one very simple model that comes from Saravesi is very simply do this process. Who do I know? What do I know? And whom do I know? Or you can apply it. Who does someone that I know? What do they know? What can I actually do with them? And then what can you do with them? Go and talk to them, interact with them. This could be employees to see if you can get feedback from what's happening from customers and from suppliers. It could be from your supply chain more directly. And then come up with ideas of where you could actually perform better. Get that stakeholder commitment, and that gives you possibly some new means. So people will do things for very low cost, or for free, for example, if they're thinking that their jobs are going to survive or that they're going to get something out of this. And likewise, it allows us to have new goals, so that it allows us to start thinking about pivoting and thinking about our new products and new marketplaces. And here's the big thing. You can go around this cycle over and over and over again. And coming from a complex systems background, I would actually say having very simple processes are really important. And the reason for this is that organizations tend to put in place large amounts of bureaucracy, which require a lot of resources. By actually having something that's simple and very, very low resource, it allows you to look and validate new ideas very quickly and at relatively low risk and low resource consumption. The next component I would actually pick up in terms of this as a tool is make sure you're validating your ideas, and you don't have to have the perfect idea. You can go out and test it, and there are a few ways that you could do that. One of the ways I do this is to have a very simple loop of go in and do something, check whether it works, and then learn what works and what doesn't work, and then use that for the next cycle. If you look at Eric Rice's Lean Startup, he does something very similar. He talks about build a particular product because he comes more from a tech background, measure the responses to that, and then learn what you can do. It's a similar sort of process. However, if you're working in an organization, you may already have existing processes that people are familiar with. So the Deming cycle is used a lot where lean thinking is in place. So as part of that, use a plan, do, check, act approach. And then from that, you can be developing cycles. So each of these cycles, know what your progress and your failure points is. It gives you a stage gate to say, okay, we're going to take this forward, or we're not going to take this forward. And that's important. It gives you a structure so that if you're working on this idea, you know what you're actually doing. But it also is demonstratable to your employees so that when they go away and do this, you can control those progress and those failure points because they'll have to report back. And then obviously you would go through various loops of this depending on how sophisticated your product or your new ideas are, so that you can test each of these ideas out. The idea here, though, is it's not random. You do it systematically so that you progress each component part with your customers, with your stakeholders, if you're developing something internally with other departments. And the idea behind this is that it's easily transferable. Once people get used to this process, it really encourages a good culture of entrepreneurship, because it encourages failure, and failure with a little f rather than a big F. So you want to have this experimentation method, because it allows you to very quickly develop products and services which are better for your customers, and also work better with your suppliers potentially. So if you remember our that we were talking about earlier on, we were talking about the possibility of introducing an electric bike. So how would we systematically test that? Well, what we'd do is we'd think about our failure points and our pivot, our potential progress points, and think about, okay, what would I want at each stage? So it could be, do customers want an electric bike? You know, if they do want it, do they want it pre-built? Does it want to be a conversion? And then from that, you can be looking at different sets of options, and this can scale forwards. And then what you would do is you would set your cycles in. So very quickly, you could ask your customers whether they want an electric bike, and if they say no, you can then stop it. Or you could go down, for example, why don't customers want an electric bike? And it might be because they're interested, for example, in fitness or something else. From that, you can keep cycling these through, and it could be that once you get past that initial point, you can empower your employees to go away and actually have a look at this and do a couple of loops, and then at that end point, they come back and report to you and tell you what they found, and then you can make a decision to whether do we take this forward, and which set of variables would we take forward. If you're concerned, for example, talking to your employees, you can fit this in with your existing sales mechanisms. And the spin method of selling, which comes from Rackham, it's a little bit old, but it's a good way of thinking about this. It's a way of actually listening to your customers and then pitching. And what Rackham talks about is understanding the situation. What's the context of that customer? Are they in a regulated industry? Are they, for example, looking to get fit? If we were looking at our bikes, are they looking at this as just a means to actually transport because they don't want to get onto buses at the moment? What's the actual problem that they're facing? What's their big pain point? And then what are the implications? Are they going to have to buy this really quickly? Is it a long-term purchase? Is it a repeat purchase? Is it something that they're particularly interested in? And then what are the key priorities? That will really quickly give you a good sense of those particular variables, while also understanding what you can actually sell. And it allows you to work with your existing customers and move beyond, because you can start to think about at what points would you pivot, and you can test out those particular components. For example, in terms of the looking at how you would actually sell a electric bike, or whether it's appropriate. So there are some simple rules I'd suggest for people to pivot. Understand the opportunity, and understand particularly the duration. If it's a short-term sales item, that's fine. That might actually help you with your short-term cash flow. If it's the longer term, then you need to think very carefully about what impact that is going to have on your organization. Set up those simple feedback loops, validate the idea, get that simple data, ask people, but also as well observe their behaviors, because what they say they do and what they actually do can actually differ. And then get those clear measures and that clear set of failure points. At what point are you going to give this idea up or go for an alternative? And if you're doing this right, you can do it in really short timescales. Instead of products built over a long period of time, 6 months, a year, this can be done very quickly within 3 or 4 weeks if you're actually doing it right, and certainly within a couple of months. And get that failure fast in place. Perfection is a real problem. You need to get your staff used to the idea that this is an experiment, that that failure is not a bad thing, that provided we learn something from it, it will actually help us produce better products and services. And it actually allows us to reduce our risk and our resource input. I see too many entrepreneurs that build a big technical edifice or a new product or service, and they've never actually tested it with proper potential customers, and they waste millions and millions of pounds in some cases, or thousands of pounds if it's an early startup. And focus on the 20-80 rule. 20% of the features that 80% of people will use. And that will actually allow you to very quickly pivot and expand that marketplace. Whatever you're doing, communicate with your stakeholders and make sure that they're all informed, and make sure it's a two-way communication as well, that you can actually get feedback from them. And as part of that, think about your scaling processes. You may want to commit £1,000 to testing out a new electric bike, but in the longer term, that's going to require you to think about developing new assets for you to be able to, for example, manufacture electric bikes. So think about what sort of scaling processes would be in place, and think about how that would affect you long term. And then in the short term, think about what can you do to help finance that. If that requires you selling a whole load of masks at the moment, for example, because it allows you to finance, that's fine. Just be careful though, because what you do in the short term will influence your long-term goals. I've already encountered this with one of the firms that I've been working with, where they've actually imported quite a lot of parts from China, and within part of their customer group, there is actually a backlash against the Chinese supply chains at the moment, due to various reasons. And so it's meant that they've actually potentially lost an amount of money because they're finding it much more difficult or much slower to be able to sell those items on. Can't do everything yourself? Well, there's some different options. There may be some intellectual property that you've got that you can actually patent or put intellectual property protection on and license out. And that could be a simple way and relatively low risk way of actually getting money for something that you can't build yourself. Getting a license from someone to actually to do something could be particularly important. So for example, in the HR industry at the moment, there's quite a lot of people who are now looking to expand their marketplace, and they're particularly looking at bringing in, for example, different sets of tools that they can risk, the Hofstad cultural measures and so on. They are actually being licensed. Alternatively, you could be buying it in, working with people potentially in your supply chain to get them to do as contractors things that you you can't do necessarily yourself. Likewise, it could be, for example, if we were looking at those bikes and we were finding that actually lots of people want apps. Well, you can't build the app yourself. Maybe though you can join one of the affiliate schemes for one of the online cycling apps. And in which case you will get a level of money for that, and you're also servicing your customers. Likewise, you can bring in areas from franchising from that as well. Alternatively, if you're still in a relatively good area and you're actually working well with your wider competitors or people within your supply chain, for example, you could be looking at joint ventures and alliances to allow you to develop the marketplace and make sure everyone is surviving and actually growing and pivoting. If you have quite a lot of money, you could also be looking at this point at takeovers and potentially mergers as well. For example, if you're having issues with your supply chain and you know that's going to be useful for when you pivot, buy that potentially up. There are going to be quite a few organizations that are looking to sell over the next 6 or 8 months, unfortunately, because of the nature of the economy. And remember as well that as you're actually pivoting, you may have to part sell bits of your business which are no longer profitable, which no longer fit your customer base. So in which case, that other people may actually want to buy those up. Last thing that I'm just going to talk about is a tool that I've been developing over the last kind of 15 years, something I call the 3+1 legged stool. And what I've tended to find is that organizations, particularly small businesses, that get their marketing and sales, their resources and their operations and fulfillment right and get them balanced, actually tend to survive and can much more organically grow. So, it's the idea about getting your retention rates on your sales, making sure you're segmenting your customers right, so you can get the money through. Likewise, getting your financial people, your data right is important. What tends to happen though is that if people start to pivot, they tend to concentrate on the innovation and not on the three other legs, and it unbalances the organization to the extent where I've seen new innovations, or I've been brought in when a new innovation has almost bankrupted the rest of the organization. So what you need to do is, as you develop that innovation using these kind of very quick, low cost, low risk methods, is that will actually help you, particularly when you're thinking about balancing your sales and your marketing, your operations and your resources. As part of that process, and if you're looking for advice, you don't have to do everything yourself. At the university, we can help, i.e., for example, run a couple of modules where we look at working with small businesses to help pivot, to actually grow, to also help them develop markets as part of their student projects. We have more of that within the business school. We have MBA students, we have people in hospitality, and students are always looking for projects. They tend to do them for free or potentially for expenses if you're getting them to do work. We also have CPD and degree programs that we can pick up. We do consulting, but as part of that, we can also help you by getting the government to part fund what we do through innovation and vouchers, and working with, for example, different research councils, Innovate UK particularly. For longer term projects, we also can help with knowledge transfer projects where you get a recent graduate who is advised by someone like myself, and they will work with you on a particular product or service or something internal to your organization. For example, if you wanted to set up a more entrepreneurial leadership style approach within the organization. And then as well, we also do applied research where we can joint bid for funding so that you can get new products and services and new ideas and ways of actually changing your organization. And we can get what we perhaps need, for example, publications and so on. So at that point, I covered what I really wanted to cover and would like to open up to questions.
Chris, that's great. Thank you. There's been a few questions that are already posted on the chat line. So if I maybe run through things in a kind of the sequence that we came up. So we'll go back to the start of the presentation and work through questions and see if anything else comes up. Early on in the presentation, you talked about the importance of the manager or the business owner sitting down and looking at what might be assets or liabilities in a different way. Is there a particular tool that you're aware of to help structure that process, or is it literally just the back of an envelope and a list of strengths and weaknesses?
There are sets of tools to do that. I think essentially that what you need, and it's certainly a tool that we're developing at the moment. I think the problem very often with lots of these tools are that they are very process driven, in not necessarily in a good way, that they don't always fit with specific types of organization. And what I would always suggest is take it back to kind of what you know, because you need to be able to communicate what you're doing for that with your staff as well. And I would say there's some very simple principles about what's what an asset or a liability would be is very often people see things like cars as assets. They're only assets if you're using them, for example, as a way of getting to work, or you're using them as a way of delivering, because they are actually quite a liability because you have quite a lot of maintenance. Anything that can be used to improve your cash flow, or if you were looking at data, if you think that data is really important in terms of your balance sheet, there are approaches to kind of look at that. Anything that you think can help you do that is potentially an asset. But I would get 2 or 3 different sets of opinions from different sets of people. Likewise with liabilities. And a really good example of this that I would pick up would be, for example, the record industry had massive supply chains that they saw as a massive asset. And as soon as you start seeing CDs and then DVDs and streamed audio come on, those have started to become assets and yet become liabilities, and yet those organizations were still seeing them from a kind of asset capability, which wasn't always the case. Likewise, at the moment, think about what your priorities are. So if your priorities are actually getting raw materials components in at the moment, and your supply chain is spread across the entire planet, and you're having problems, what was potentially once a potential asset because it had you low cost, at the moment may rapidly be becoming a liability. So it depends on what your key priorities for the business are and for your products and services. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, definitely. And kind of expanding slightly from that, there was a follow-up question about how would we make sure that we don't overestimate on the balance sheet when deciding whether something is a liability or an asset? Do smaller companies need to think about employing
Yeah.
some sort of external auditor or support for that?
I would say from a financial point of view, it's probably worth having a chat with your accountant as one element of that. But also as well, I'd actually talk to people that you know as well, and actually do 2 things. Get them to obviously get someone you trust. Get them explain the process and what you think is an asset and a liability, so that you don't just get an echo chamber within your organization. Maybe talk to someone from another business or from a different area, and get them to actually think about the estimations of what assets and liabilities are. You can also, there are organizations such as Business Gateway who will have advisors that you can also talk to, and they can be a good useful point to bounce off. Obviously you can talk to people like myself within the universities. We're always happy to come along and have a chat with people. I think out of that, very often the best thing to do is just get more than one viewpoint, and get some viewpoints from outside of the organization, whether you have to pay for that or not. And I think for me, it's I see so many people who think that their organization has massive amounts of assets and massive amounts of potential, and actually what really they have is they have 1 or 2 small key assets that they're not leveraging very well. And from that, I think talking to something like a business advisor about how you can actually leverage those assets is really important. For example, I would say the amount of data that most organizations have is actually a really asset, but they don't use it very well. And it's worth actually talking to someone from a data background to actually understand what that data could actually tell us. Hopefully that answered the question as well.
Great. Again, you talked about the importance of keeping the process simple as you did that kind of review and assessment before you decide which way you want to pivot. And there's a question around for a slightly larger organization, if you're talking about companies maybe with 50 or more employees, have you come across a good example of how you can engage everyone in that process, or should that?
Yes. Yeah, so one of the things I did I can't actually reveal the exact name of the company because of an NDA, but I was working with a Southwest England building services firm, and they had various people from kind of different backgrounds. They had people from cleaners through to plumbers, through to electricians, as well as the kind of more traditional kind of delivery services. And what we did with them was that we actually putting in place a stage gate process. And the way that we did it was very similar to this, which was that anyone could come along with an idea based on something that they were doing. And we took two approaches to it. The first was new products and services, and then the second was how can we actually improve our internal systems or our work with suppliers and so on. And what we very simply did was that we started with something like a suggestion box. And then, so that could have been done electronically. We asked whether someone would like to take that on board, whether they felt they had the skills. If not, we selected someone who we thought had the skills and had an interest in that idea. And then we went through that process of saying, okay, if it's for example, the introduction of LED lighting, can we test that out? So we make someone responsible for it, and it wasn't necessarily someone at a very high level. It was someone at line staff level, and they were actually empowered to within reason ask questions of their customers as they were actually talking to those customers, and they actually brought on board, for example, people who were electricians, people who were actually dealing with the customers on a sales and customer relationship management level, and they then coordinated that approach. And then recognize that actually those LED lights were actually useful in particular situations. From that, then there was a commitment to bring in a wider designer within the organization to then look at how lighting could actually be better used. And that went through a particular process where there were known parameters, and they knew that very quickly if customers were not particularly interested in it, or if they weren't prepared to actually test it, possibly for free, that there probably wasn't a marketplace for it. And what we did was we just set up with those cycles specific stages where at a particular point where the person who was in charge of that bit of a project could then report back. And then there was because that individual employee had actually taken it on board, they were actually then given an incentive, and it was something that they could we actually gave them a choice of whether they actually took a bonus, or it was something they could use towards their particular promotion, or whether it's an area that they would actually then like to take much more responsibility for more generally, if not in a managerial role, but certainly in kind of customer management role. And that came through really well, and they introduced quite a lot of LED lighting out of that, and the entire process cost them a couple of £1,000 relatively, plus the bonus for that particular employee. Hopefully that answered the question.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. Somebody is saying the spin model was new to them. Would you recommend surveying core customers in that way to kickstart your pivot process? Almost immediately going off and doing that to get some ideas.
Yeah, I would, and one of the good things about talking to your existing customers is that you can try and get some decent feedback from them in what's happening with products and services, because at this point, because they're going to be money strapped potentially, they're going to be looking at their suppliers more generally anyway. So asking them questions, okay, what are we doing well, what are we not quite doing so well, in a sense, is a good starting point. But then you can actually be asking them, well, are you having other problems with other areas that are kind of related? And it might be that they are, and you can ask them why they're having problems with that. That will give you a good starting point, and it's something that you can then, rather than getting a brand new customer in, it's something that you then can say, well, look, if we can do X, Y, Z, would you actually kind of move much more towards us? We could actually start thinking about working with you to create more integrated services. Would that be beneficial? And what I tend to find is that two things tend to happen is either they say, well, no, not really. We just want to keep it an arm's length relationship. But yeah, this is where we think your product's going to improve. So you tend to get some information. Or second, They actually feel really good about it, because you're asking them, and you're asking them to be collaboratory. And I think one factor as part of this is, if we're thinking about how the way that supply chains may be having to shift, working potentially with our customers and down our supply chain can be approached in this way. You can try it with potential new customers as well. I always go and kind of after the initial kind of preamble, when I'm talking to people, for example, at events. Might be slightly more difficult now because of COVID and social distancing, but it's something you can still do. Is, get through that initial preamble and say, okay, so what are the big things that you're facing at the moment? Oh, well, and then you can actually have questions that come after that, and even if it's not something that's directly in your area, it gives you some ability to actually understand what problems they're facing. And it could be then saying, well, actually, okay, look, we're actually working with another organization that's in that area. They seem to be pretty good. Can we connect them together? And it's a good way then, if you do that with other organizations, you can get them to do the same, and say, well, look, can I recommend Blogs Plumbing, for example, because we actually work with them and they're really useful. So that people tend to react to people's social relationships, and very large corporates kind of often have to go through existing tender processes. But if you understand what their main problems are, you can actually tailor what you're doing in terms of those tenders that you may be actually going forward with for new business, and you're more likely to win it. It's not perfect. It stacks the deck in your direction, though. I'm hoping that actually answered the question as well. I went off a couple of slight tangents there.
No, that's great. And we've kind of looked at ways to help people with the opportunities of looking at a way to pivot. But a question is asking around the risk assessment framework, and if you can recommend something that people can use when thinking about the extent to which the organization might currently be able to afford a failure. You talked about the fact
Yeah.
not to be afraid of failure, but how do you kind of ring fence that within an acceptable limit?
So I'd go back to kind of traditional ISO risk few frameworks around. I would say work with what works with you, and if you have an existing risk framework within that, and you're looking at a kind of wider pivot, then and you'll think, well, actually that's a really unacceptable risk. What you may be then having to think about is, rather than having a major pivot, what you may want to think about is saying, well, look, that's a high risk strategy, so we will commit only a certain amount of resources to that. What we'll concentrate more of this on is, how can we extend to our product base to our existing customers, or how can we extend the marketplaces that we're already looking at, and then go back and be honest with your managers, with your ops managers and so on, and say, look, if we suddenly got a whole load of orders, could we actually be able to cope with that? If not, what you might want to do then is just select certain types of potential customer groups where you can then scale it up by doing two things. First of all, getting the income that comes from them, but secondly as well, you can test things out with those initial customers, and be particularly ruthless with those risks. If you think it's a major risk and you can't get it forward, then make sure you've got clear points in that process at a first or second or third stage of going through the iterations, where you say, look, here are the clearly definable criteria where we will stop on this. Obviously, if you're in a situation where all of your customer base is starting to drop off, I'm going to mention the airlines at the moment, that actually that obviously you're in a point where everything is becoming a major risk. So in which case you need to think about the priorities of getting revenue in, and that might mean that you do have to take some very, very dodgy risks. And I've seen a couple of organizations have to do that before. It's not a great position to actually be in, and I've been called in at that point. And sometimes it is literally a case of saying, right, okay, if we're in that situation, can we go back to basic survival principles? What can we sell? How can we sell it? How can we actually rationalize our customer base? And sometimes you will have to be very ruthless in thinking about those risks. But I would go back to some basic ideas about the ISO risk, and getting a sense of what are going to be our really high risk, what are our medium, and what are our low risk. Right, okay, we will concentrate more resources on those low risk items because we know that that's going to move. If everything is becoming high risk, then at that point I think it gives you quite a lot of scope to be radical, because, but putting it bluntly, I've seen a lot of organizations who are very timid in terms of their risk when they're in a survival stage, and they don't survive. If you're in a survival stage, you seriously need to think about how you actually going to keep that organization going.
Yeah, and kind of again, just maybe expanding on that, there's a follow-up question about how you would, in your experience, best communicate that process to employees, because it is a risky process. You know, if
It
you're
is.
changing
It
the
is.
business plan.
I would be say have a level of honesty with them, and say, look, we're in a risky situation here. Obviously, what we want to do is keep the organization going forward. We might need to change what we're doing and the approach that we're doing. But what we want to actually do is work with you. What ideas have you got? Now, people tend to react in one of two ways, which is, oh, actually, well, oh, this is terrible, and this is all going to be problematic. Or secondly, you'll have people who will step up. I tend to find that very often you have more people step up and say, look, well, I've got an idea. Take the idea on board, have a test of it. But if you communicate this sort of process and say, look, what we'll do is we'll give you some scope to be able to go away and test this. Here are the points where you need to come back and tell us. You need to kind of demonstrate the process that you've been through. Just so that we know that the data is okay. At that point, we can make a decision to move forwards. And if you say to them, look, actually we can't take this forward because we haven't got enough resources or something like that, then at least they know that you've taken on board their ideas and that they're a legitimate risk for it. They may then turn around and say, well, actually, if we did this and that, and if we actually talk to these other sets of people, that might actually help us. They may come up to some of those resource problems, particularly. And I've seen a few organisations that have done that, where never underestimate the creativity of your staff. You will have some people who will just follow standard processes, but you will also have quite a lot of people who are actually really on the ball, and you can empower them. And but by actually putting in place those structures to say, okay, here's a cycle, here's where you need to come back, here's the progress and the failure points. It's a very simple, low-cost way of doing it, and it's actually quite understandable by staff. And you need to make sure that the managers who are in place buy into it, admittedly. But it could be that you have someone who's responsible for bringing these new ideas up, and that they're actually quite high in the organisation, and that they can then talk to people who you can kind of skip levels. That it can actually be really empowering for your organizations. And in a situation where they may be feeling quite desperate because of the fact that they're worried about their jobs, it tends to actually reassure them, I found. I know with a couple of turnarounds that I've been involved with before, simply being honest with them and then saying, look, here's some things that we want to try. It actually, people do actually feel as though they're actually being empowered, and they're much less likely to leave the organisation and go elsewhere, putting it bluntly.
That's great, Chris. Thanks. Couple of questions as well then on kind of ways of accessing support. You talked about innovation vouchers and potentially being able to get some government finance to help.
Yes.
What's what's the timeline for that kind of process?
Um, to be honest, it does slightly vary. What we've had, for example, with innovation voucher schemes before has been that what we will do is we'll have a conversation with you. We'll get an understanding, a bit like using the spin approach actually. We what we'll do is we can then get kind of a clearer understanding of what your problem is and what those key deliverables are. So talking to someone like myself or someone else within the university, with other academics, or potentially drop people like Ron an email. What we will actually do from that is we will get an understanding of what's involved. We will write a proposal. We'll make sure you're happy with that, and then we can submit it to those innovation areas. Now, it does vary between 3 weeks and 2 or 3 months for a response. However, what the government has been doing with a lot of this, so both the Scottish and UK governments, is that they have been putting more employees onto that, so that the turnaround is much shorter. So some of that money will come out of things such as the COVID fund. There's the more traditional innovation voucher processes. So usually we can the timescale that's being quoted back to me is probably about 3 or 4 weeks. So it's not the shortest of turnarounds, but it gives us some scope to be able to be having wider conversations. And even if we don't necessarily get the funding, because we've got a better understanding, you may be able to get access there. It's something we could set up student projects, and so you could actually work with us and work with our students to be able to work on that area. Or it's something that we might say, okay, right, what we can maybe potentially do is fit it into some of our wider research funding, and we may be able to help with that way. But usually the time scale at the moment is really quite short, because the government is obviously trying to prioritize keeping businesses going, and I suspect they're going to put quite a lot of priority onto that, and particularly thinking about supply chains and also exporting, I would say, at the moment, not just because of COVID, but because of issues to do with Brexit and potentially trade discussions that are coming through in terms of the EU, Australia, and the US. And we do have experts who, in terms of the university, who are much more expert in that than me, and they can actually certainly do some advisory for that. But if you're looking at some of the wider things like with KTPs, it usually takes around about 3 months. Have a conversation with us. It depends on the size of the project, to be frank. And there may be things that we can be doing in the short term where we can actually help, not just with our students, but some basic advisory that we could then take forward. And I've done that with a couple of firms that we're now in the process of looking at longer term projects. COVID's obviously got slightly in the way for that, but we're looking at building longer term innovation projects that we can then work with those organizations, and that work gets paid for by the government, or a good proportion of it does.
Great, Chris, thanks. We've just got a couple of minutes left in our time frame, so I'll just give our attendees a chance, if anyone's got a final question that they want, either pop your hand up or put that in the chat. And just giving people a moment to do that, if I can thank Chris for his time and expertise today. It's been a really interesting discussion, and there's lots of really practical and useful things there that I hope people will be able to take away and help them as they prepare their own plans for the next few months, and how their business will pivot and emerge from the lockdown. So thank you, Chris, for your time. As I mentioned at the start, we will post a link out to everybody who's been on our attendee list today. So thank you for your time. We hope that will give you an opportunity to review it at your leisure. And please watch out for for further webinars in the upcoming weeks. I haven't had any final question posted there, Chris, so thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Ron, and thank you for everyone attending. If there's any other questions that you've got, that is my email address. Do feel free to pop me an email message through. I'm hoping to generate some of this as well as an infographic or some of the basic processes. So I will pass those on to Ron, and he will obviously with the links be able to pass the link through to the infographic on. That will appear probably next week, though.
Fantastic. Thank you, everybody, for your time today.
Are we all good? Are we all good?
I think Mike, yeah, may still have one person in the background, but I think that went very well.
Good, right, okay, I'm just going to press stop on the recording.